Hello, my name is Jeannine Vegh, and I'm a psychotherapist in the Columbus, Ohio area. And I am presenting this series called Staying True to the Self in a Healthy Relationship about long-term marriages and how do they last. And with me today, I have Evelyn LaTorre, and she is going to talk about her 55-year marriage to Antonio.
Thank you, Jeannine. Love talking to you. And it's actually going to be, we're coming up on number 56 in June. We will have been married 56 years and together 57 years. So
congratulations. Are you going to do anything to celebrate?
You know, that's one of the differences that I have found between the cultures. I wrote a book just a couple years ago about how I met and married my husband. I was a Peace Corps in Peru. And this was 1964 to 66 that I lived in this town and got to know him. And then we married at the end of it, partly because I was pregnant, but I also loved him. Nice two things went together. But I hadn't really realized the cultural differences that might affect our marriage by living in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I decided, actually. And I was fortunate in a way. I was fortunate that he didn't have a lot going for him in his home country. I could tell he was very intelligent. And I didn't really appreciate the fact that he had fallen so deeply in love with me, because I'd never had that happen before. And if you read the book, you could find out how we very, very almost closely didn't get married. And
that's the whole suspense of the entire book is, will they or won't they?
Yeah, back and forth and back and forth. And I since have found that a lot of relationships are that way, but I was 22 to 24. And what did I know? You know, when I look back now, I think how little I knew, which was probably good, because in my own rational way, I had thought about who I might marry. Well, first of all, I thought for many, many years that I would be a nun. And then when I was in the Peace Corps, I experienced more males than I had before. And I thought, you know, maybe I won't become a nun. And I'd been putting it off anyway. I mean, I put it off to go into the Peace Corps. And so when I met Antonio, I just kind of like a magnet kept going back to him, even though we would have these disagreements. And the main reason was he had nothing going for him, because he didn't have an occupation, he didn't have a job, but he was such a great person, and our values connected. Now, I don't know that I vocalized it much at the time, but I did keep a journal. And in my journal, I have found passages where I had said how happy I was being around him and why. And a lot of it had to do with our common values. And I think the more I analyze it, and I haven't had a lot of time until I started writing my memoirs to analyze it, but he was raised in a rural area, and I was raised in Montana with kind of rural values, middle America values, really. And not that on the coast they don't have those, but you have time to appreciate them when you're not rushing from appointment to appointment, which is what happened. My family moved to California when I was 16, and I could see the difference right away. Well, now in looking back, I can see that's where our family started having difficulties. Is we moved from slow Montana, where my father would come home from working on the railroad and take a nap in the afternoon. And then he wanted us kids his 5 kids, including 3 girls, to be educated. No, 4 girls we had at the time. And I lost track. I was the oldest of 5, and there were 4 girls at that time. And he wanted us all to get college educations, which I credit him for his forward thinking.
Yes.
And to do that, they had to move the family to California so that my mother could work. And that's where the family started coming apart, but I was already raised, and so I got the benefit of 16.
Well, and when you say coming apart, your parents didn't get a divorce. I want to be clear about that.
No, they didn't. I sometimes question whether they should have, because the tension in the family over my father worked nights,
Mhm.
and that disrupted his circadian rhythm, I think. Again, I don't think we didn't realize all this back in 58 when we moved here.
Mhm.
We had more material goods, and I did live at home during college because that's what we could afford, but I got a scholarship to college because I thought it was going to be an ed. So we were doing okay, but and you'd have to read that first book to see some of the tensions.
Which is?
It's called Between Inca Walls. And to give a background on myself, because I'm kind of the main character, I do go into my childhood starting when I was 5 or 6. And I didn't even realize until I had finished writing the book that I was a very adventuresome person. So it's not unusual that I would choose to go to the Peace Corps shortly after the Peace Corps was instituted in 1961. John F. Kennedy started it. And Sergeant Shriver was the director when I went in. And so
It's his brother-in-law, correct?
yes, right. And the way he set it up was just a great way he set it up, but it wasn't terribly organized in the field. I don't know if that was because most Peace Corps volunteers are told that they need to be very flexible, and the whole organization, as I know it, has been almost too flexible sometimes. Like when I was assigned to the Andes of Peru, and when I got there, the regional director who was in charge of volunteers had so many volunteers coming in, he didn't even know my group was due to come in, and he had no placements for most of us.
Oh, wow.
And
yeah,
so,
I do remember that. But at the same time, don't you think it kind of pushes the Peace Corps volunteers to be stronger people and to have to be more self-sufficient?
yeah,
Which
we
were.
all are pretty resilient. The ones that don't look like they can make it get weeded out.
Yeah.
And I started with a group of 102 that went for training at Cornell University.
Mhm.
And we ended up with around 70. And then quite a few of those even left almost as soon as they got into the country. They just didn't realize what they were in for. Now, I think they do vetting more extensively, perhaps.
Good.
And the training is in country by host nationals, people in the country, which makes a lot more sense. But I feel glad that I got to go to Cornell. I'd never been to the East Coast. And it was a great
So
experience.
they no longer scale the Peruvian mountains for training?
Well, no, we went to Puerto Rico to do a lot of hiking and stuff, but they don't do the outward bound type of thing, which was to my benefit. I know what outward bound does now, and I know how it is. And I know, like, I couldn't swim. I grew up in Montana. My mother didn't want us swimming in the rivers because she thought we'd get polio. And she was quite protective. And so I didn't learn to swim. So in the Peace Corps, they test your swimming ability. Well, I knew enough to dog paddle around the pool, but then they said, now do the backstroke. So I just had to look at what the other people were doing and try and do the backstroke. And I was swallowing so much water that there was a guy following me with a pole when I was in this Olympic-sized pool at Cornell. And so then they instructed me on swimming. So then I did get to swim.
Good. That's good. But
you say, interestingly enough, when my husband came here, he also didn't know how to swim. So there was a period when we took swimming lessons together at a local pool. There are a lot of things that we did together. And I guess you would say we kind of grew up together, because 24 was kind of young. And nowadays it's kind of young to get married. In those days, I think there were more people getting married at that age, but it might be too young. And when you mentioned, are you authentic to yourself or true to yourself, you were saying? Yes. I think that is so essential. And I'm not surprised that a therapist would come to that right away. Mm-hmm. It took me a while to realize, oh, this is why maybe this is one of the reasons we made it, is that I think his growing up, he grew up without his biological father around, but he had a loving grandfather and a lot of relatives, because in Latin America, there's an extended family, and he always had cousins and aunts and uncles, and all his life pretty much, that would look out after him and care about him. And so he had a similar background to mine. And I think by my being free to roam the hills of Montana, and then I was sent off to high school when I was 13 and lived on my own, you learn pretty fast what you can do and what you can't do, and it gives you a lot of confidence
Mhm.
as you overcome certain obstacles. I
Well,
think that,
and you said something about Antonio didn't have a lot going for him, but you didn't mention that he did have a college education and he was in college
well,
when you guys met.
right. He was studying economics, which was not his choice. It was his stepfather's choice or somebody else's choice. I'm never sure whose choice it was. And he wasn't happy studying what he was studying, but he did like mathematics, the
Mhm.
math part of it. But when I say not a lot going for him, I meant career-wise, because in this country,
Jobs.
in my mind, you don't marry somebody who doesn't have a skill and a job. A woman picks out a husband who can sustain the family,
Mhm.
and that he did not have that. And I didn't know his capability to do that.
Right.
And he knew nothing of the United States. I don't know that he knew about his own capability to do that. Now, if I want to compare how he has, shall I say, progressed in my terms, in terms of job skills and all, I can compare him with his cousins back in Peru. I often wonder, and the second book, Love in Any Language, I do a lot of questioning about, would we have been happier, and would other mixed couples have lasted had they stayed in the country of the husband's origins?
Exactly.
And because he wasn't tied so tightly to his country. Marie, my roommate, I think was in love with Darcy, who was a good friend of ours. He was somewhat older, but he had a career already.
Mhm.
And there was no way he was going to leave Peru. So them getting together was out of the question.
Yeah.
And but as long as I've known her, she's communicated with Darcy. She feels very fond of him. He died a couple of years ago, but
Oh.
he's written books. He would send her the books that he's written. I think he married twice. And I met his, the last time I was in Peru, his house. I went to his house and met his wife,
Mhm.
and she took good care of him. And then suddenly after we came back, we found out he passed away.
Oh.
So there are a lot of friends I have whose marriages I could compare. I don't know if you as a therapist think that's a good idea or not, but I compare whether it's good for me or not.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So you were talking about values. So tell me about your faith and how you already kind of gave us a hint that you wanted to be a nun. So you're obviously Catholic, and that probably matched well with the Latino culture. So how has faith played a role in your marriage?
Well, I certainly understood the religion in Abancay, where I was stationed, and in that whole area, because you're right, it's very Catholic. What I was taken aback by was how it looked like so many of the people um, would do things like on Palm Sunday, they would practically climb over you to get a palm. It was like a magic thing for them. It was a much more, I don't know what the word is, but it wasn't the logical, reasoned religion that I'd grown up with. It was a much more emotional religion. And I was very critical of it in the beginning until I talked to one of the priests there. There were a lot of priests, both from the United States that were missionaries down there, and also native priests that I got to know. And I remember one of them said, don't be so critical, because emotion is a big part of life. And I think that's why I might have had a hard time accepting the thought of marriage to Antonio and accepting his love, because I had not developed the emotional part of me as much as he had.
Mhm.
I think the Latin culture is much more in touch with their feelings
Mhm.
and their sexuality
Oh,
and
yeah.
the humanness of people.
Mhm.
And that's part of what I liked about and loved about the culture.
It was
Now,
really exciting. It brought out the passion inside of you.
good point. Yes, very much so. The music, even the food, hot food and stuff. Yeah. Yeah, but so I did fall in love with the culture, but I also fell in love with the man. And he was like, partly he was in his culture, and then he adapted very rapidly. I didn't appreciate until I wrote my memoir how quickly he adapted. He knew English within a year, probably 6 months, enough to go. Well, right away we enrolled him in English as a second language classes.
Mhm.
When we got up here, you'll have to read the book to see all the steps he went through. But his first job was earning, a couple dollars an hour at St. Vincent de Paul fixing bicycles.
Bicycles, yeah. Yeah, but I wanted to mention that you spoke fluent Spanish when you were in Peru.
Yeah. He says he taught it to me.
Oh,
Now, the fact of the matter is, I had 2 years of Russian in college because I'm the kind of person that when there's something new, I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. And we were in the Cold War. I think it might be coming in handy again right now to know a little bit of Russian. And I have been to Russia a couple of times, and I could actually go to a post office and get a stamp and mail it in Russian, but I'm definitely not fluent. And it wasn't the right language to study because then I spent a summer in Mexico, and I had taken a little bit of Spanish, not in college, but we were taught a little bit of Spanish before we went for the summer between my junior and senior years of college. And then in the Peace Corps, we had like almost all day long Spanish, Spanish, Spanish. And I was moved up from one class to another. The last class I was in was an interesting way of learning the language. And I think I recommend it. We memorized a play by a Peruvian playwright, and that gave us the idioms and the music of that particular country's way of speaking Spanish. They say they speak Castellano, which is a more pure, well, I shouldn't say that, but it's a more to the book Spanish than like the Spanish you hear in Mexico.
mhm.
And but it's very similar. I mean, I get
The
along.
Spanish in Mexico is very fast versus like in Spain. Because like when I watch films from both countries, in Spain, I can sort of follow along a little bit with the limited Spanish that I know. But in Mexico, I'm just like, I'm lost,
Yeah. Oh, I hadn't thought of that. I think
Yeah.
probably in Peru it's slower too. I hadn't. I'll watch that the next time. Oh well, some people. It depends on the person. Some people speak very quickly, and others slowly. As a
That's
rule.
true. I think also Mexicans have more use a lot of slang
Yeah.
terms
Yeah.
that you're not going to see necessarily on a Spanish.
Well, Peru has their own slang terms, and that was the beauty of memorizing a play written by a Peruvian. It happened to be a play about an alcoholic husband who beats his wife, and I think I was the wife. So I learned quite a few phrases to sling at him. I don't remember them anymore. I haven't needed them. But you were asking about faith. My husband admitted years later that he used to go with me to mass. I went to daily mass, which I had gotten into the custom of doing in high school and in college to a certain extent, because I went to both Catholic high schools and college. And he would go with me. Later, he admitted it was more to be with me than it was to, because he believed in the religion. And in fact, when we got up here, he stopped going to church with me. And when our youngest son was about 2 or 3, and I would take him to mass, and I just couldn't manage this toddler who was climbing all over the seats. And my husband was back sleeping because he had worked late as a bus boy. I finally just decided, and then they were preaching. I don't know if it was the particular churches I went to, but so many of the churches, the pastor was asking for money. And I think part of the time his back was still to the congregation, speaking Latin. And I thought, what am I doing here? And so I took the values that I learned in the religion. I think it was a good religion to grow up with. And I stopped practicing, much to my mother's dismay. My parents went to daily mass at the end of their lives. They were always very, good Catholics. And my mother prayed daily, I'm sure, that I would come back and go to mass on Sundays at least. I did go on holidays.
Mhm.
And I have to say, we baptized our first son, but we didn't baptize our second son. And I don't know that it has made a difference for them. They probably don't even know, because yeah, I found it's possible to live a good life. And I had to tell this to my mother many times. I said, Mom, I'm still a good person with a lot of good values, even though I don't go to church every Sunday.
Mhm.
So that's not what's glued our marriage together. Yeah. So
It's more the values, but also perhaps the fact that you both grew up with a spiritual values and faith that kind of helped you to understand what was important as far as commitment
that
and
could be that the spiritual is more important than the material. Neither one of us are very materialistic.
Mhm.
And I think we found a lot of values in one another. I found in my journal that my husband must have remarked at one time, and I totally it didn't register with me the first time I wrote it, and until I went back to write my memoirs, but he liked my forthrightness. I was just listening to Deborah Tannen talk about how communication is so different in relationships. And I tend to be a very forthright person. Frankly, I think it partly comes from studying psychology and being a therapist from time to time. You want to tell it like it is.
Mhm.
And I tend, and I was that way even in college, even before I did therapy. And I'm not sure where that came from, but I think the more you know, the more confidence you have, the more you feel that you can put your opinions out there. But anyway, that's something that my husband admired about me before we were
Yeah.
married.
It's probably has to do with being a firstborn. I tend to be very forthright as well. So let's talk about any issues of concern that came up in your marriage and how they were dealt with.
Well, I've been doing a lot of research. I don't know why. I guess I'm still trying to understand what I wrote in my second book about, well, I guess because there's more and more coming out. There are more and more couples that are of mixed, well, race, but also cultures.
Yes.
Now, each person has their own culture, but I mean foreign cultures. When I married my husband, I think about 2 to 3% of the marriages were between cultures. Now there's like 16 to 17% of marriages that are that way. So there's more and more research that's coming out. And I can mention like 5 things that I had to deal with, or that he had to deal with too. But since we chose to live up here, he had to make more of an adjustment in some ways. I had to adjust to being married, which was an adjustment. And he had to adjust to being married and being in the United States.
Mhm.
So the first thing I faced was my family's disapproval, because I had gotten married in Peru and written them a letter, and it took 2 weeks for the letter to get to the States. And I even said in the letter, by the time you get this letter, I will be married to Antonio LaTorre. And I had been writing about him. My sisters could tell I was in love. My mother suspected. My mother is very intuitive that way. And she suspected something, and she kept sending letters saying, well, now remember, your children will have to be brought up Catholic. And do you know how many, have you agreed on all these things? And she was right. I mean, a therapist would say, have you discussed this, and this, number of children and how you feel about it? We discussed none of that.
Oh.
We just didn't. I don't know. I think it was our age.
And you were in love. You were more
Yes.
stealing those stolen moments, kissing and hugging and so forth.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. And then, of course, the other thing he had to face was the language barrier, because he didn't know English when he came here, but he went right to learning about it. He was very open. A lot of Latin men that I met, and men in period, let me say, I had gone with maybe 10 guys in the States, and it never clicked with me. And I sometimes analyze that. They were very irrational and they weren't as passionate as he was. I could, go on and on about some of the guys I dated, but for some reason and my husband says I was just ripe for the picking. And I think at age 22 to 24, your hormones are raging, and I think that was true for a lot of us in the Peace Corps. And a lot of them married one another. There were quite a few marriages of one another. In my group of 60, 25% married Native people,
Wow.
Peruvian, mostly men marrying Peruvian women.
And they brought them back here?
And they brought them back here. Not all the marriages lasted. Several of the wives have already passed away, which surprises me. But most of the marriages did last between Peruvians
and you actually, in your second book, talked about a divorce that occurred between one of those marriages. I remember you bringing it up.
Right.
It was difficult for you.
Well, a part of it has to do, the couple that I kind of compared, that the husband is still a very good friend of ours. His wife now has Alzheimer's. And he's saying now he thinks that what broke their marriage up was that she had the beginnings of Alzheimer's way back 50 years ago.
Behavior.
I don't know if that can, I don't know that you see Alzheimer's things, but the truth of the matter was he was older when he came. He already had an occupation and he wanted more say in the marriage than she gave him, is his opinion. And so he wasn't listened to. Now, I often think, oh, did I listen to Antonio when we first got married? Well, my book relates several incidences of real, I mean, we could have broken up several times afterwards. It was not easy. And especially having a child right away and having the pressures of, you know, of work and everything. But I think because he was intelligent and he was willing to adapt himself. I mean, I taught him how to drive. That's one of the times that we could have easily have, you know, separated. And the big one is gender roles and expectations. I now appreciate how he saw me as an equal or maybe even superior in many ways. And he never put me down. He always wanted me to get as much education as I could get. He never objected to my working outside the home. Now, in the beginning, I thought, well, that makes life easier for him. But part of it comes from the respect, I think, that he had for my intellect. He isn't somebody that ever put me down.
Yeah.
And I was allowed to be who I was right from the beginning of our marriage. I mean, I did make a lot of adaptations. I couldn't travel as much. And I forced myself to listen to somebody other than myself. I mean, my sisters said I calmed down tremendously as soon as I got married. I mean, before that, I was just splitting here and there. And
doing whatever you wanted.
Yeah. If you ever look into personality type, I'm true to my personality type. And but he is an introvert. He's as introverted as I am extroverted. And that the combination was good for both of us.
A balance there.
I think so, because I brought him out of his shell, still do more. And he makes me grounded in a lot of ways.
That's great. That's really wonderful.
And I couldn't see that and had not put it into words until I wrote my memoir.
Yeah.
And when you write is when it helps you. Well, Joan Didion said, I write because I want to see what I think. So that's what happens.
So did you do all the 5 obstacles along the way in your marriage? Because you said there were 5.
Oh, well, I went into family disapproval, language barrier, gender roles and expectations, different values and traditions of the couple. Okay. I discovered right away that, I mean, I knew it was fortunate in a way that I knew his culture by having lived in it for 2 years, not just the Peruvian culture, but the indigenous culture, because he grew up on a hacienda and very much has the indigenous values. And I think that's partly because living in the countryside, you grow up around nature and the cycles of nature, and we both have a big appreciation for nature. In fact, we still 3 times a week we walk around a lake that we live nearby, and we both we need nature. But things like Christmas, for example, they celebrate Christmas quite a bit differently. There aren't as much gifts for anything. Birthday,
it's not so materialistic like here.
Yeah, right. And he doesn't even remember when his birthday is a lot of times. I give him a card and remind him, and I used to give him gifts, but
He's not a good
Anymore.
person.
Yeah, I mean, if I can see something that he needs. The big one, and I guess I'll reveal this from my book because it comes quite close to the beginning. I was due to give birth to our first child 6 months after we got back. Let's see, we got back. I came back in July, and that's another whole story that was, I am amazed when I go back, and I was amazed when I was counting how long it took me between coming back and that I would come back without him, because I knew I was practical. I've been really practical in our marriage.
Uh-huh.
And within 2 weeks, I had a job, a full-time job.
Yeah.
Now,
And
I
you
also,
be dishonest about the fact that you were pregnant.
right. And those days,
Mhm.
women weren't allowed to have jobs if they were pregnant. I also remember applying for a gas credit card, and I couldn't be given one, but my husband, who didn't have a job, could have been given a credit card because he was in school for gas. I never buy gas from that company anymore. But so in January, when I went to the hospital, he dropped me off and said, well, I'll see you at 10.
Mhm.
And this was like at 7 o'clock in the morning. And I thought, what? And these were the days before husbands went into the birthing rooms. But he didn't do that for our second child either, when he could have gone into the birthing room, which I just, I accepted a lot. I chalked it up later. First, I was very hurt that he would just drop me off. He says, when I asked him about it, when I was writing the book, he said, well, he consulted with the doctor, and the doctor thought the baby would come at 10 o'clock. And so he thought, well, that's the time he'd come back. Now, at the time, he was working the evening shift as head of the busboys at a local restaurant. And so he hadn't had a full night's sleep by the time I got him up to take me to the hospital. So he went back, and he's still that way. He sleeps when he's tired. He eats when he's hungry. He doesn't do things according to my schedule necessarily.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
We do eat on the same schedule now. We're on the same eating plan, and over the years we've synchronized a lot.
Yeah. Now, you have 2 boys, and were there any complications with the pregnancy or delivery or raising them? How was that handled in your relationship?
Well, I had gone to get a master's in social welfare, and so I studied a lot of child development. And I worked in schools as a school psychologist and school social worker, and then later as an administrator of special ed. So I felt I knew children. Plus, I was the oldest of 5 children. Well, 6 eventually. My parents had another child when they moved to California. And so I didn't believe in lecturing children. That was his tendency. You lecture kids and tell them what you want. I think he still feels that way, I think. And so at one point, he just threw up his hands and let me do a lot of the disciplining. However, there was a point in my boys, I'd say in their 30s and 40s. I don't even know when it was, when they were older, when they stopped speaking to one another because of something one had said to the other. And my husband said to each one of them, look, he's your brother. This is ridiculous. And they listened to him. So when it counted, the boys they respect him a lot. I talk to them every week. They are very different personality types. The younger one is my personality type, and we clash more than I do with the older one. I was explaining to you yesterday how I had trouble with my computer, and my younger one gets impatient because there's certain things I don't learn very quickly. The older one was as patient as could be, much like his father. And I just loved his attitude. The younger one challenges me a lot more. Now, the younger one has traveled the world. He spent a year in Peru. He very much loved his grandmother in Peru. She was all love, just pure love. And
she came to America, didn't she? At one point?
A couple times. The first time she stayed for 6 months, and we asked the immigration department if she could stay for another month. I think we were asking, I can't remember now. And they didn't answer us. So we sent her back to Peru a week late, or maybe even a few days later, and her visa had run out. So the next time she came to stay, and I had everything ready for her to stay with us, the United States wouldn't let her in. They said, oh, she overstayed her visa. And my husband was in Peru at the time visiting, and he called and he said, do you still have that letter from the immigration department saying that she could stay longer? Well, I didn't have that letter anymore. So that kind of gave me an inkling as to how the immigration department works. I mean, and now it's much worse in terms of waiting and waiting and waiting for, permission to do anything regarding immigration. We were also very fortunate that my husband was able to come up on a green card just by showing our marriage certificate. And then they had to vet him and see that he didn't have a criminal background. I mean, even in 1966, they were doing a lot of checking, but they let him in with a green card. And then I don't think he got his citizenship for like 25 years. I think he had been here for 25 years.
Wow.
And the reason was he didn't want to lose his Peruvian citizenship. So after 25 years, I think it was Peru that said, oh, you can have dual citizenship. And so then he became a US citizen. And so traveling has been much easier. You should have seen like Slovakia. They'd never seen a Peruvian passport. He used to travel on a Peruvian passport and they didn't even know where Peru was. And there were some countries that were questioning letting him in on a Peruvian passport. So that's one thing, becoming an American citizen makes it much easier to travel the world.
Yeah. Because you guys have, say something about that. You've been to every country except for what, a couple?
Well, no, I think there are 180 countries and we've been to maybe 105 of them now. And some of them we go back to time and again, like Peru and Italy. We've lived a total of a year in Italy and we've studied Italian together. My husband loves learning languages, so I go along with them and we usually are in the same classes. That's an interesting dynamic right there, because we can get competitive and he has his way of studying and I have my way of studying and we both end up at the same level. I am more outgoing, so I will use my language more readily. And then he'll correct my errors. So, but no, that's been the delightful part of staying in this relationship. In the beginning, I'm trying to think, I did in my second book, I go through all the steps. And in the third book I'm writing too, how in the beginning, there were so many things my husband wouldn't do. Like I wanted to invest in real estate in California. It was going up like gangbusters, almost as much as it's done lately. And my father lent me the money to purchase, well, I could only afford townhouses at the time. And my father and my husband would do the repairs and the painting and all that on these townhouses. But my husband signed a quit claim to anything I bought because he didn't believe in it. He wouldn't go along with it. So when he would say no, I would find a way around it. And I still did a lot of what I wanted to do. And it turned out, eventually he could see my wisdom. I'm trying to think, I'm sure I made some mistakes along the way. Traveling was another thing that he, in the beginning, traveled very little, even around the United States. He would say, well, he had to work. Well, he really didn't have full-time jobs and I wasn't bringing in that much money anyway. So I thought that was my value. You should travel with us. And his value was, well, he's more sedate. Traveling has been in my system now since he got me to retire by saying, look, we'll travel if you retire, because he had been laid off. And this is in 2001, he was laid off. In 2002, I finally retired. And that's where we traveled together. And he's a great traveling companion because he knows more of the history and we just, it's great. And in any marriage, I recommend getting away from who empties out the garbage and all the mundane things, going off and getting away from it all. It'll bond.
Absolutely. And I've learned in some sort of workshop that I took on couples that if you can travel together, that's a really good sign that you're going to be a long-term relationship, is how you travel together. That and remodeling houses.
Yeah. No, I know couples that have split up the first time they travel and they are totally incompatible. These are people that didn't get married, but it was good they traveled together first. And
see that they didn't, that they weren't good for each other.
Well, because you are an entity unto yourselves, and you have to solve all the problems you encounter together between you.
Yeah, you're completely dependent on each other, especially if one speaks the language, the other doesn't, or if neither of you speak the language, you have to depend on each other to get around and figure things out.
Yeah. In our later years, I would do all the planning, get the air tickets, and I usually do all the planning of our social life anyway. And I just got tired of doing it. And so now we travel with Overseas Adventure Travel, and they do most of it. So,
oh, that's nice. So what would you have done differently if you had to do it all over again?
I've given that some thought, and I know it's kind of a cliche to say nothing, but I think maybe I would have written my memoirs earlier so I would realize and appreciate so many of these things that I'm telling you. I don't think I really appreciated my husband quite as much as when I looked at our lives and his part in it, because life goes by so fast that you don't have time. I didn't take time to dwell on a lot, and particularly how free I've been. Like, I would go off to Mexico for several weeks and he would take care of the kids, except I missed the kids and they missed me. And so then I took them with me a couple times. And but he didn't, I don't remember him complaining or saying, you belong at home. I still pretty much did the cooking and the cleaning, but gradually he, in the very early years, he did very little of that. But as, I don't know what changed, especially as we're retired, he's taken over washing the dishes all the time. And he cooks breakfast and I cook. We only have 2 meals a day. I cook the second meal, and we collaborate a whole lot more than in our early years when life was so much busier. I mean, you can tell in the book, I go from resentment, and my kids remember. My kids remember. I often worry about the two things that they might have taken away from their early lives. My dieting, I constantly dieted, and complaining about my husband not having a full-time job.
Yeah.
And
I just wanted to point out that it was 13 years before he got an actual
full-time job,
a real career job.
And part of that was because he was going to school, and he could not go to classes and work at the same time the way I did.
Yeah.
Expecting him to be like me,
right,
created problems in me. And he had to listen to some complaining. And that, I'd say that's the biggest takeaway that I didn't realize early. And I guess if I had it to do over again, but I don't know how you mature more quickly in these areas. I married him for a number of reasons that I didn't even realize in the beginning. I do now, his values and how kind he is and how much he loved me, and still does. But throughout the marriage, there have been times when one would be, well, Gottman says this, you lean in and out. One of the big awakenings for me was when I took a course from Gottman and we did his questionnaire, and I wasn't supposed to look at the questionnaire, but I did. And I could see my husband was leaning out of the marriage. And I thought, oh, that was kind of a shock to me, because he didn't talk to me that way. And my philosophy was, as long as I'm happy half of the time. I've since read some advice is that sometimes you're going to be giving 80% and your spouse will be giving 20%. But then there will be times when your spouse gives 80% and you give 20%. So marriage is a give and take kind of a thing. And if you can last throughout that, now sometimes it gets to be overwhelming, but my personality type loves harmony, and we will do almost anything to keep relationships harmonious.
That's
maybe even to the detriment. I mean, there aren't, I often look and say, 8 years going to school and not supporting the family. There aren't too many American women that believe that maybe I should have done that. And especially if he wasn't doing a good part of the housekeeping and taking care of the kids and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But he was always there for me, egging me on. He wanted there are things he wanted me to do that developed me and that he didn't do.
Yeah, I think he allowed you to be yourself. And I think that's what you valued a lot in that marriage, in this marriage, is that you loved him, he loved you, and he just gave you that space to be who you were, and you gave him the space to be who he was.
Eventually I did when and that's where I say, I think in the beginning, coming back to the States, I wanted him to be like the typical American male.
Right.
Work all the time, support the family, mow the lawn, things like that.
Mhm.
But that's not why I married him. I had rejected men that could have filled that role quite nicely.
Right.
And I wasn't attracted to them. So
Mhm.
there was a reason, besides that he was super handsome.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what advice, Evelyn, would you give to young couples about marriage?
Well, obviously, don't try and remake the person you marry. Appreciate them for the qualities they have, and give them some slack when you don't see qualities that you think you need. You can find a lot within yourself.
Mhm.
My philosophy, probably from the time I was 13, is if you run into an obstacle, just figure some way around it. And I was allowed to do that in my marriage and in my life. And I've been very fortunate. I have had a good support system. Not everybody has the support system I have. And I think towards the end of the book, I point that out. I had scholarships to go to get graduate degrees.
Yes.
I had nearby parents that could pinch hit. My mother would not
Yes.
raise my kids for me, but she would find really good babysitters for me.
Uh-huh.
And we had food stamps.
Uh-huh.
We had our rent in a nice 2-bedroom apartment at University Village in Albany was $100 a month when
Uh-huh.
I think my scholarship paid me $300 a month. So, and we had a sliding scale for childcare, good childcare. I mean, if women today could count on those things,
Yeah.
I think it'd be easier to stay in marriages and for couples to stay together. I think it's economic factors that can tear you apart.
Yes, I agree with you on that. And that's, I was listening to somebody on the radio, I think it was many years ago, talking about how the transplanting of relationships, people getting married and moving to California or moving to even Indiana. I'm in Ohio, so that's what I meant by moving to Indiana. The person was saying that when the couple does that, they've lost their support system, they've lost their family, they've lost being able to go to grandma and saying, grandma, husband is frustrating me, how do I deal with that? And so this person was talking about how that has really caused a lot of marriages to collapse because they don't have that support system from all the migration of moving to other places. Where again, originally people stayed together in little pockets.
From my mother's Catholic background, divorce was never an option either for her or for her kids. Mm-hmm. Now, I have 2 sisters that have gone through very difficult divorces, very painful divorces for them. Mm-hmm. And I looked to see what was different because, and I would talk to my mother sometimes when I was unhappy, and she never took my side. I mean, she would stay neutral. Mm-hmm. And because it was a value of hers, marriage was a sacrament and was, sacrosanct. You don't get divorced. Right. I think it hurt her almost as much as my sisters when they got divorced.
I bet. So, I'm sorry. No. So let's talk about your future. You were telling me before we got on camera that you were writing a new book. But also, I don't know if you want to speak to the housing situation that you and Antonio.
I'd love to. Yeah.
Okay.
That's another area where I've been so blessed with a husband that I have. And I think, again, it comes from living in community in Latin America, that he values that. And there's a movement, there has been for many years, a co-housing movement. Uh-huh. And there are 180 different groups in the United States that have formed, and what they do, groups of people who want to walk out their front door and run into their neighbors, as opposed to the way the houses are built. A lot is that they purposely build doors so that they don't face one another, because they think people don't want to run into one another, and people think they don't because they don't know the people who live next in the apartment next to them. And so they build houses with garages out in front. Well, in co-housing, you don't do that. You put the cars in the background and you build units that face one another. You build a common house that you have 2 to 3 meals a week together. You eat together, and you do things like put the mailboxes inside the common house, so that people purposely run into one another to greet one another. Human beings want to be together.
Of course.
Maybe not on top of one another or always in the same house.
Yeah.
But each in co-housing, each person owns their own unit. It's usually a condominium-like thing. Here where land is so expensive, that's how ours are going to be. They're going to be condominiums that we own. And then you have a common house. And like I said, we'll probably have a yoga room. I think we're going to have a hot tub there. I know that a lot of the co-housing people, every afternoon at 4, they get together with a glass of wine. I don't drink wine. They're telling me, well, then I'm going to have to substitute tequila. I don't like tequila. I just don't like the taste of them. So I'm going to have to figure out some way that I can be socially relevant.
Even if it's a glass of water and seltzer or something.
Well, there are fake wines that I really do enjoy. So okay. We'll see. We'll see. But for 7 years, this group in Fremont has been, we were looking for land for 5 years. 5 years ago, we found land, but there were, quote, historic buildings on the land, and developers wouldn't touch it because of that. The city said, no, you have to leave those buildings there. And there was a huge barn in the middle of it. So it really prohibited any building really doing much with the land. And we went to City Hall and showed that it really wasn't a typical farm, and that anyway, there were a lot of things we had to do. So last November, we actually purchased 1.25 acres. And last weekend, we spent the weekend moving on Zoom, moving the units around, considering which way the sun comes in the winter and the summer and the wind. I didn't know you had to consider all these things. And we've gone together and we've gotten an architect, and it's really quite an interesting process. But the process itself is helping us get to know and appreciate one another, much like, in a marriage, as time goes, you get to know one another better. Mm-hmm. And we are going to have probably 32 units. There are 9 of us that are committed right now, and we should have the drawings up in the next few months. And I kept saying, how is anybody going to want to buy unless they can see what they're getting? Yeah. So we are now in the process of plotting out our units. The end of March, we're going to be developing the community room. Mm-hmm. And then we design our units. They're going to be 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom units. Oh. And then we're open for business, and we want to attract as many people as want to come to our lovely weather. We have perfect weather. We're right in the middle of everything. They're putting in a new BART station within half a mile, and you can walk to everything. And in fact, I took a survey to see how many people wanted garages and how many people were going to have cars. Several said no cars, because we're going to have electric cars that we can just borrow when we need it. Why does everybody have to have a car all day long when most of the time it just sits? It'll be very ergonomic and very ecologically sound. Fremont already has said any new construction has to have solar panels, no gas, no natural gas hookups. So anyway, the big thing is the community. What you're buying is and they've shown in studies that people live longer as they age when they're in community, and they're healthier. You mm-hmm. tend to take care of your health more.
Yeah. That makes so much sense. It makes so much sense that you are able to look out for each other. You're not having to think about nursing homes. You're thinking of a very holistic lifestyle where you look out for each other, take care of each other. There's actually a 97-year-old, my babysitter is 97 years old. She was living in was like an apartment, but everything was inside. And everybody had these arrangements with each other where the neighbors would call each other every day to make sure they were okay, if they hadn't seen them in the lobby or outside or something.
Yeah.
And they didn't eat together, but they had lots of parties. And they would always congregate, like they would have a band come out on a Friday night, or they'd have movie night or something like that. But they would also, when I'd go to visit her, she would, in the good weather, she would be outside on the rocking chairs, and there'd be, like 7 or 8 people out there. Yeah.
We're going to have a community garden and things like that. It's Mission Peak Village.org, I think, or .com. I can't remember which. We're on Facebook if anybody is.
Are you a nonprofit or a for-profit?
Well, we each own our own homes, so it isn't like we're a nonprofit, but we do have 3 units. In order to get a break on not putting 2 parking slots for every house, we're hoping that the city, if we put in 3 low income units, and we think we're probably going to have to rent those because no low income person can afford to buy a house in this area of California. Yeah. We were in Silicon Valley, and so the prices have just
Fremont, California. Yeah.
Yeah. So so we will have three units that we'll vet the people, and they'll need to live by community standards, etc. But we want a real mix. We're different than some co-housing groups. We want a real mix of ages and ethnicities, and we have that. We have a good beginning for that.
Okay.
So, and even incomes if we can do it.
Well, lastly, let's talk about your next book.
I don't have a title for it, and I wasn't sure there was going to be another book because coming out with one book each year was really difficult. Like, I didn't realize how much I would have to be out there publicizing my first book. First of all, when I published it, I thought, well, maybe family would enjoy it. I wasn't sure who would enjoy it. Then I thought Peace Corp people. Well, the Peace Corps just gave me a big award, and that was really complimentary. And so then I started to think, I get the most rewarding thing about writing a book and publishing it is I get notes from people that say how much it's meant to them and how much they can see parts of my life in their life. So I thought, what am I really passionate about other than my trying to understand my life? And the thing, of course, that I'm very passionate about is travel.
Yes.
So I started to think when I did a lot of traveling.
Oh, that's a wonderful idea.
And I went back. Well, the problem still is, even after I got back from the Peace Corps and got married, I didn't keep journals. For the second book, I had to use Christmas letters that I wrote every year and would hit the high spot. And then I could tell what happened when, and the certain things I had forgotten happened. And so I was able to put that in my Love is in Any Language. This third one, I took my children when one was 14, he turned 14 in Europe, and the other one was 18, just about to go into college. And my husband at that time didn't want to travel. And he did have a part-time job with Berlitz, teaching Spanish at Berlitz at that time. We got a big tax return because we paid an enormous amount of interest on our house. And so we took that and went to Europe for 2 months. And so I thought, I'm going to write about that. But I hadn't kept any notes. And my children, if you think about what you remember when you were 14 and 18, it probably was very little, too little for me to put in any memoir anyway. But I've been able to do that. But it's not enough to fill a book. So what I think I'm going to do is I've got 11 chapters of my kids and I traveling throughout Europe. And I didn't even know how big of a thing that had been for us. And my youngest son continued traveling. He got the Wanderlust, and most of his life he's traveled all over, and he's gone back to some of these same places. The older one is much like his father and doesn't see a need to really leave Los Angeles. But by going back and looking at that trip, I can see how we bonded. and how we faced adversity together and how it made my children much more flexible. I start off with, we stayed with a family in London. Those were before this is the 1985 we did this. Well, I won't go into the whole plot.
Before bed and breakfast is what you were going to say?
Well, there were bed and breakfast, and we had the Farmer's Guide on, Europe on $5 a day, but exchange. I was looking for the where you exchange. No, they had home exchange. It was Intervac had started, and so we stayed with a family in London for very little money. I didn't realize how reasonable he was until I was thinking about it lately. And my kids were taking long showers every day in London because it was muggy. And one day he said, "Do your kids shower every day?" And so then by the end of the trip, but then where we would stay, sometimes there would be group showers, one group shower for the men, and my kids wouldn't go there. They wouldn't go there. Or we would have, if we didn't have a room like in Paris, we had a stinky hotel. It was very reasonably priced, but with a big German Shepherd in the doorway. Really interesting things that came back. And this is what happens when you might write your memoirs. Memories come floating back.
Once you start plugging into the story.
So when I traveled with my husband, I did keep journals. Every country I've been to since my husband and I started traveling, I have kept thorough journals, is what we've done every day and things like that. So I'm going to intersperse the 11 chapters traveling with my sons, intersperse that with later traveling with my husband to some of those same places. And kind of how we developed and learned, and because you have to have some growth in memoirs, you have to have growth. So that's where I am. I have no idea if I'm going to publish it or not. I just love writing it and reliving it.
Well, I hope you do. But thank you so much for taking your time out of your day to talk to me about your marriage, so that hopefully young couples will watch this and learn a little bit about what it takes to have a 55-year marriage.
Okay. And thank you. I'm glad you have your program and they're doing so much good for people. So thank you, Jeannine. I hope it doesn't take I have to write a book before I see you again.
Oh, I hope not too.
I'll see you on Facebook and or no, maybe not Facebook, between, on online.
Okay.
Online.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.